I were to ask you, Krista, for the sort of principal significance, what's the main kind of core idea that we associate with Hegel, you would immediately and without much hard thinking say what? What's at the real heart of his thinking? It is kind of the main thing we think of with Hegel. What everybody knows, any school kid, fifth grader, you say, what do you think of when you think of a Hegel? And of course immediately the child responds with I don't know, she goes.
I feel like it's right here, but I can't
It's right there.
the words.
Thank you, Krista. You're a complete and total failure. But other than that, you're a wonderful person. Just trying to get you guys back into the spirit of being in school here, you know. Jacob, what is it? What's the core idea associated with Hegel? First time you take Philosophy 101 in college and somebody mentions Hegel, you'll immediately be able to just casually remark that Hegel is well known for
his philosophy of history.
Close. That was better than Krista, yeah. But actually, Stephen, what I'm after is
Dialectical Triad.
thank you. Yes. Y'all got that? Please get this into those brain things in your head. This is called the Dialectical Triad. And it is, as Jacob suggested, his philosophy of history. But there are many philosophers of history, of course. It's Hegel that gets the credit of coming up with this somewhat distinct, really unprecedented interpretive scheme by which he would try to explain history as a series of conflicts. But what do the conflicts produce? What's the core? What's going on? The dialectical triad is the right answer. And Jordan, what is happening with the dialectical triad? What's it accomplishing or achieving? Or what happens according to Hegel in connection with this?
I don't know. I just have dialectical triad with a line under it.
Know this. You know? Don't know anything about it. Just there's got to be an answer to some question on the test. All right, who can help out here? Joe? What's the kind of main point of the dialectical triad?
It leads to progress.
Progress. All right. But is progress driven by a certain rather unexpected force? What is the force that produces the progress, Matthew?
I mean, for conflict.
Conflict. It's a dialectical triad. Dialectical means conflict. Means debate. But in this case, unlike most debates where somebody wins and somebody loses, in Hegelian philosophy, everybody wins. We're all winners. There's no losers. There's only winners, right? Well, that's a good Hegelian approach. And so you've got conflict between thesis and antithesis, and out of it, and that's exactly the term that he uses, the German Geworfen type means to lift out of, and so we get this new thesis, B will say, but then it comes in conflict with non-B, and out of that comes a new synthesis, and on it goes. And history is this unfolding story of conflict. And every time there's progress, every time there's growth, movement flowing out of the progress, we catch a glimpse of God. God is in it. God is not out here managing transcendently these events. God is in these events. God is part of this unfolding dialectical story. In fact, this is in some sense God himself. You know. Please.
I'm a little confused. So is the dialectical triad, is that progress, conflict, and another one, or is it just something that he throws out there? I'm kind of confused by that.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following your question. Let me go ahead. Do you want to ask it again, and maybe
Yeah.
I'll get it more clearly?
The dialectical triad.
Yes.
Is that, maybe I'm just not understanding it right, but is that progress, conflict, and...
No. Okay, I follow your question. Okay. The dialectical triad is, what you want to remember is thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Okay.
See? Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Producing another thesis with another antithesis, producing another synthesis. So it's kind of rumbling along. And by the way, for Hegel, this isn't just happening in one place at one time. The whole world is filled with these dialectical triads, and sometimes they're not triads at all. It's more the dialectical piece of it. It was a later interpreter of Hegel who gives us this term dialectical triad. Hegel is more subtle and nuanced than that, but that's still famously associated with Hegel, and that's what you want to keep in mind. But Jordan, the idea is that as this process continues, it is a process that represents progress, you know. So these are not that. And in this class, I mean, probably the best example we have of this, and it would really fit the Hegelian model, would be the thing we've seen with Parmenides and then Heraclitus and then Plato. But then Plato gets Aristotle and you get, you know, some other synthesis, Plotinus, let's say, or whatever. And down through history you have that. Well, basically Hegel is saying that's happening in all different quarters, all different times, but it's always ideas. So he's also called a dialectical idealist. Because this is a great conflict of ideas. Yes, go ahead.
In history, there are those ideas that really aren't a part of the synthesis. Those are usually just like the two main ideas, right? So how do we account for other ideas that are just kind of floating off in the distance?
He includes them. Some are more conspicuous than others, some probably more important than others, but for Hegel, virtually every idea out there is some part of the great mind of God. He's very inclusive in that sense. There's no wrong answers. You would love to take math from Hegel, because no matter what you write down, it's a good answer. It's the right answer. And so even ideas that seem a little bit out there, a little less important, a little more bizarre, Sidney, somehow or other in Hegel's great scheme of things have their place, have their role. Yeah.
But if something's wrong, then how?
Oh dear, no, Hegel wouldn't.
Well, if you do a math, like
There's
in
no
your,
wrong answers, dear.
in your
There's only right
example,
answers. We're all winners here, don't you? There's no losers.
but in your example, when you have the wrong answer, it's really a wrong answer, but he doesn't call it a wrong answer, but it is wrong.
Right.
How can you progress from that if it's not right?
I don't know, beats me how you do that. But Hegel builds a whole philosophy around the idea that that's exactly what happens. That even that wrong answer has a little truth in it. And that truth is going to somehow show up in the next iteration of truth. I guess my hope is that you're all sort of offended by this. I want you to be offended by it. I want you to think to yourself, this is really stupid, you know. Now, if you ever have a chance to read Hegel, you're going to realize the guy was not stupid. Nobody can write that completely unintelligibly and be stupid, you know. You've got to be smart to be that obscure. But at the same time, if you can see through the sophisticated vocabulary that he uses, you realize that the fundamental message isn't going to get us very far. It's not going to put anybody on the moon, ultimately. you know. It's not a good way to do science, but it is a good way to liberate ourselves from being strapped, as it were, to an absolutist kind of theology that really hems us in some. Was that, yeah, go ahead, Josiah.
Would Hegel say that there is a point where we reach a state of perfection in progress, or is it just that it keeps going on?
No, he envisions that this process goes on and on and on and on and on, but somewhere out there you reach kind of the end of the road, and that God himself will be perfected at that time, that God himself is being perfected in this process, and we are all part of it. So there is a final, ultimate conclusion to this. When it happens, Hegel doesn't try to answer that. There were some who followed Hegel who thought, well, it's happening right now in 19th century Prussia. Look at this, how perfect it is. You know? But a lot of people didn't buy that. They didn't quite think that, you know, was persuasive. All right. What I want to do in the remaining time is just talk a little bit about what happened after Hegel. If you got this, you got the basics of Hegel, plus what we talked about last time. You should have in your notes the points where he criticized Kant, you know, the thing in itself, those things. The emphases in Hegel, history, dialectic, all of that. The dialectical triad, those are the basics. And really what I want you to appreciate here is more what happened. We start with Kant, and Kant gives us, as you know, this sharp distinction between the noumenal and phenomenal. And then out of Kant, you have two different, you have a ton of philosophies, but if I could really oversimplify it, you have two basic sort of philosophical traditions. Now there's a dozen here, there's a dozen here, so I'm just talking in very broad generalizations, but it may help you think about it. I'm going to call one of these traditions optimistic and one pessimistic. And just because these are the kinds of things I want you to be aware of, these are my terms. These are Gore's terms. I try to tell you, sometimes I give you terms of art. If you go off to college and use the term dialectical triad, they'll know what you're talking about. A philosophy prof will know. If you talk about the optimists that come out of Kant, they're not going to know what you're talking about, because this is Gore's distinct contribution to help you. So don't get confused there, but I think it will help you if you see what I'm driving at. The optimistic tradition that comes out of Kant starts with Hegel. And it's called optimistic, not because Hegel was just kind of a cheery guy, you know, but because Hegel is optimistic that we can recover the noumenal that seems to have been lost with Kant. He wants to recover it. He believes we can recover it at the phenomenal level. And so Hegel is all about finding at the phenomenal level the great transcendent reality that's called by Kant the noumenal. So he thinks we can do that. Thus he's an optimist. There are others on the pessimistic side who say you cannot recover the noumenal because the noumenal is not there. All we have to deal with is the phenomenal. That's the end of the story. It's superstition to try to get this noumenal discovered down here. And so they simply try to build a philosophy out of the phenomena itself. One philosophy that came out of this is called Phenomenology. Interestingly enough. I get lost in all these letters in here. Phenomenology, you know, sound it out again. Phenomenology. If you say it fast, then it sounds like you know how to say it. Phenomenology. Phenomenology. Positivism. Pragmatism. Existentialism. All of these philosophies are pessimistic. Because all of them despair of a noumenal order. There is no noumenal. There's no transcendent truth. There's no God. There's no ultimate truth. There's only the phenomenon, only the experience. And so we try to make philosophy out of our experience. End of conversation. Hegel is still trying to find an idea. That's why he's called an idealist. Because he thinks in that phenomenal level there's still an idea that we can discover. There's some sense of God. There's some sense of the absolute spirit, as he calls it. The absolute ego. He's trying to see some greater reality in the phenomenon. How many of you have ever looked at the little, kind of like a little optical illusion sort of thing that were popular a few years ago? And it was one of these things where you look at a page and it just looked like random stuff. And then you kind of look through the page and you'd see images as if they were behind the page. How many know what I'm talking about? It was sometimes called magic eye or something like that, okay? And it took a little bit of skill to get that, you know, because it's like if you were looking at the page right here, you'd never see it. You had to sort of focus as if you were focusing on something 2 or 3 feet behind the page, and then you'd see this elephant or this whatever, you know, or some simple message. You all know what I'm talking about, right? Okay. That to me is really what if you could think about that philosophically. Kant holds up the page. The question is there anything behind the page? Is there really anything there that's noumenal, or is it just the randomness of the phenomena? So, if you follow what I'm saying here, here is the observer. This is you. It's Krista, actually. You make her beautiful. But okay? Okay. Chris is very happy. Here's the page. You're looking at the page, and as you look at the page itself, it is pure randomness. It's just, you know, miscellaneous color shapes. They have no sense at all. If you can somehow focus at a level that's back here, then you see some message, you see some meaning. So we're going to say, here's meaning, but this is just nonsense. Now, the problem is, if all we have is the phenomenal, it only appears nonsensical. All we have, in a sense, are Kant's percepts. That's all we've got. But can we see in it, through it, behind it, those noumenal truths? Hegel says yes. You know, Comte, a name we'll look at, says no. Hegel is optimistic. We can see it back here. Phenomenologists, positivists, existentialists, pragmatists say there's nothing back there. If you try to focus back there, you see nothing. So forget it. It's not there. Build a philosophy out of the pure randomness of the phenomena. So that's the 19th century, philosophically. You've got 2 schools of thought broadly. Now, like I said, there's a bunch that are here and a bunch that are here. We're going to take a brief look at all of them, or at least a lot of them. But every one of them can be put in one of these 2 classes. So now we've mentioned this before. What are some of the names that would be optimistic? That we can look through the phenomena and see the meaning back here if we just have eyes to see. If we just have a philosophical acumen to look back there and see it. What are some of the names that would be associated with a kind of optimistic assessment of the prospects? For example, Sydney, would Freud be one of them? Freud would be. He says we have to look, in a sense, behind the screen and see the psychic forces at work in every human person. You can see it there. So you're on the right track. So who else? What are these are names we've all talked about, or we've talked about most of these before. We just get them kind of now classified a little differently. So Jacob.
Did you say Hitler? Or I don't know what you...
I mean, this is 19th century.
Oh, 19th
people.
century.
19th century, right. See, Hegel says at the beginning of these are philosophers now. Hitler would be here, but I wouldn't call him a philosopher.
Maybe Nietzsche then?
Nietzsche, I'm going to put for here. Another name, by the way, I want you to be able to spell. I remember, I think, one year that I spoke at graduation, I called on a student to spell Nietzsche, just to prove she could do it. I was very nervous about it. But I think it was Sam Dupree, actually.
Very nervous.
Yeah. So, you know.
Is that
You never know what's-
Z-H-E?
What's that?
Z-S-C-H-E?
Yeah, so it's N-I-E-T-Z-S-C-H-E, Nietzsche, or you'll hear some people say Nietzsche. And you tend to pronounce it the way you learned it, and I learned it Nietzsche. So I say Nietzsche, but others say Nietzsche, and you'll hear it either way, and the best counsel I can give you is pronounce it the way your college professor pronounces it. Good idea, so listen, Nietzsche. You'll hear it both ways. But Nietzsche says, what? God is dead. The transcendent is not there. And he is a nihilist. That's really what you wind up with, is just the randomness of the phenomena. There's no noumenal to perceive. What are some other names, though? 19th century philosophers, just generally, who comes to mind?
Would Marx be under?
Sure, Marx would be here. Because Marx sees behind the conflicts in history. In this case, he's a dialectical materialist. He says the dialectic concerns economic and political forces, but he sees in them meaning. He sees this ongoing progress heading toward a wonderful communistic utopia in which we all live in a wonderful brotherhood of sharing everything in common and loving each other and stuff, So that's kind of optimistic. Who else? What are other 19th century philosophers that might come to mind? Ben, who's a 19th century philosopher? Any name that comes to mind?
No names coming to mind.
Who are you reporting on?
Nietzsche.
Hmm.
That was what I was...
Okay, we got your guy up here. Stephen, who's a 19th century philosopher? Don't ask him, he doesn't know.
Schopenhauer.
Schopenhauer, very good. Excellent, yeah. Any ideas here, Megan? Which side do you think he would go on? He's more complicated.
He'd be a pessimist.
He would be a pessimist. Excellent, very good. He's actually called a voluntarist. Schopenhauer, who basically reduces this entire experience, this entire human experience, what he calls the will. And he doesn't see any great meaning behind it. He sort of sees us being carried along by great forces, and that our will is sort of victimized by them. Yeah?
Give us a little more guidance on how to spell Schopenhauer.
Let's see, Megan, can you spell Schopenhauer for us?
S-C-H-O-P-E-N-H-A-U.
That is correct. Y'all catch that? Who else? What's another? Josiah, who's another 19th century philosopher that pops to mind here?
Well, I'm doing my report on Kierkegaard.
Okay, where would you put Kierkegaard?
I think he'd be a pessimist.
He would be a pessimist. In a strange way. I'm going to be a little bit cautious with Kierkegaard because he's also a Christian. And so it's not that he denies that there's a noumenal level. In that sense, you could say he's not He's not a pessimist in the way that these others are. Most of these guys are atheistic, not Kierkegaard. But Kierkegaard is somewhat Kantian because he still thinks we get to that noumenal level by faith. So I'm gonna kind of put him in a class by himself, but if I had to put him one place or another, I would with Josiah, put him on the pessimistic side. Jacob.
I'm not sure how you pronounce his name, but Comte?
Okay.
C-O-M.
Comte, right. C-O-M-T-E. Is anybody reporting on Comte? Did I sign that? So I'm putting him. Okay, that's very good. That's exactly right. Comte goes with a philosophy called positivism. Comte does have an idea of progress, but it is not progress as we find it in Hegel. The word positive, as used in positivism, a synonym would be particularism. He wants to take the particulars of human experience and construct out of it a philosophy. But there's no universal themes. There's no great unifying ideas. He denies that. But he thinks if we just look at all these particulars, I wish I had one of those magic eye. I would make it much more dramatic. I only thought of it just standing on the spot, this very day, this very moment. Thought of that as an illustration of the point. So for future reference, I may think, but if you had one of these, if you can imagine them, they're just chaos, aren't they? They're just little details of nothing. You see nothing. But Comte says, let's look at those little details of nothing and try to make out of them something. Not because there's something back here, but just in and of themselves. That's called positivism or particularism. And he would be a good example then of a pessimist, because he doesn't think there's this underlying theme that pulls it all together. Who else? What are some other names that come to mind? Jordan.
Darwin.
Darwin, sure. Where would you put him?
I believe he'd be like optimist.
Absolutely. Darwin, of course, carrying out the themes of this dialectical philosophy into biology, interpreting biological data with what's called kind of a meta-narrative here of this scheme of dialectical struggle. And now you've all committed to memory and can say in your sleep, as I'm sure you do every night, if you're drifting off into La La Land, the full title of his most famous book, which is Laura, Darwin's most famous book, full title. Sorry, that is not going to fly. I want the full title. Didn't I? I've given you this, haven't I? Did we do this in here? Yeah, twice. Twice? Okay, that's plenty. How many times do I need to say it? You want to redeem yourself, Krista? Here it comes. Krista.
Okay. The order of the species of the process of natural, I mean the natural selection.
Thank you.
Or the preservation of favorite races. And
Thanks, Coach. You've all got that, right? Somewhere in your notes, you do need to know it. One of these days I may give you a one-question quiz. Write the full title of Darwin's most famous book. You'll either get 100 or a 0. The origin of the species by means of natural selection, or the preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. Well, the whole notion, notice how Hegelian that is. The preservation of favored races in the struggle for life. That's a purely Hegelian title, but of course it's applied in this kind of biological context. There's a theme going on in the evolution. It's all going somewhere. It's heading towards some great kind of conclusion.
I don't know if you could call these guys philosophers, but I was thinking of Thoreau and Emerson.
Yeah, they're called transcendentalists. Thoreau and Emerson what would you do with these guys? They're not really philosophers, they're more kind of literary characters, but they are eminentists. If I had to put them somewhere, I'd probably put them here. They are kind of pantheistic. They want to say that in sort of communing with nature, you get some sense of God, you know. That's kind of the idea. And that wouldn't be too far distant from Hegel. I just don't know if you see in them the dialectical piece. I'm not familiar enough with either of them to know. Maybe some of you are. But I think of them more as just kind of mystics, just American mystics. They go out, they look at a pine tree, and they go, ah, and then they write something lovely. And isn't that about right?
Yeah.
All right, what are other 19th century philosophers? Krista, please.
Oliver Wendell.
Good, thank you. Where would we put him? Which side do we put him on?
The optimistic side?
Yes. I'm not going to treat Holmes separately because we talked about him some last year in civics, so you should have some recollection of him. But if I could just revisit Holmes momentarily here and try to push this point a little bit further in light of our immediate discussion. Up until Holmes, well, I'm going to leave this here. Krista's still here. She's in law school now. Okay. And up until Holmes, the way in which people thought about law was based on ideas like you'd find in Blackstone, where there's natural law, there's transcendent law, and it remains fixed and immovable, you know, so that great quote. Well, after the effects of the 19th century, Hegel especially, Darwin especially influenced Holmes and others, this whole notion of dialectical interpretation of the law became very fashionable, and Holmes is the one who made it fashionable in his book entitled The Common Law. And it was a redefinition, really, of the common law, and it gave rise to what was called the case method. I don't remember how much we went into this last year. Does this ring a bell at all? Did we talk about the case method at all? I kind of doubt it. Anyway, I remember when my first week in law school, 1983, first week, where they had a week-long orientation in which they essentially are trying to scare you to death. You know, that's the objective. You're all going to flunk, and none of you are going to make it. It's kind of like going to the first week of drill camp. You're all a bunch of losers, you're a bunch of idiots, you can't do anything, you're all going to, you know, and they kind of make you mad, and then you go to work. There's an old saying in law school, the first year they scare you to death, the second year they work you to death, the third year they bore you to death, you know. So that was kind of my experience. The first year I was terrified. And by the time it was over, you realize the emperor has no clothes, but the first year, the first week, one of the most profound things that was stated, I didn't even appreciate it at the time, but somebody got up, one of the profs, don't remember who, and said in this kind of orientation lecture to these incoming freshmen, future lawyers of America, now here at Gonzaga Law School we use the case method, this person said, and I thought, okay, cool, we use the case method, wrote that down like that's important, you know. Well, I didn't realize that was a term of art. And that term goes back to Oliver Wendell Holmes. I didn't realize that until I graduated from law school, you know, that I found out that these things had roots, had meaning. I just thought it meant we study cases. Well, duh. Everybody in law school studies cases. They studied cases back with William Blackstone. That wasn't the novelty. The case method was a term standing for an evolutionary view of the law. That's the coded message of the phrase case method. Because up until Holmes, the idea was that there is transcendent law, and that law doesn't change. We didn't vote it into existence. We're not going to remove it by voting it out of existence. It's there. It's a given. It's been put in place by God, And the lawyer's task is to discover the law in the context of the varying cases that come along in life. You know, in the days of Oliver Wendell Holmes, nobody had heard of the internet. Well, when somebody invents the internet, then you learn about internet piracy and downloading music illegally. Oliver Wendell Holmes wouldn't know what any of that stuff meant, but the principle, thou shalt not steal, still applies, doesn't it? We need a new case, or a new case helps us discover how the law applies in this new set of circumstances. That's the old classic method. Well, according to Holmes, there is no transcendent law. The law is in the case, and the cases themselves represent conflict. It's a dialectical approach to cases, in which you see cases in conflict with cases, and somehow through them you begin to see the underlying theme of an evolutionary progress. The conflict typically, in Holmes' view, was between the ways things are and the way they are becoming. To use an example in our own culture, abortion. There was a time when the ballast of our culture was anti-abortion. You know, that would be the typical ethic of the American culture. When I was growing up, the word abortion was hardly used in polite conversation. It was just kind of an ugly word, almost an obscene word, you know. Well, according to Holmes, that was, as it were, the thesis. And then you have a rising antithesis, which we call a kind of pro-abortion, let's say. And the two conflict. And the conflict is represented in the cases. The cases are the evolutionary evidence of this conflict that finally resolves into a new thesis, Roe versus Wade. Cool. So all of the laws that we have are evolving based on the changing values of the contemporary community. And that kind of language now finds its way into Supreme Court cases, you know. Well, for Holmes, then, the law is it's floating, it's changing, it's evolving. It's always balanced by the kind of the ballast of precedent, but it's always pushing towards some great future. He assumes law always improves. It's always getting better. We're always changing in a good direction. But it is an evolutionary process. And that's called, then, in the world of law school education, the case method. The case method stands for evolution. So it's just one example of many where you've got that same kind of thing going on. For those of you who wind up in law school someday, which I'm sure many of you will, then you may recall that. It's still that way, really, today. Others. What other 19th century philosophers come to mind? Any others you can think of? Anybody reporting on anybody that we haven't yet mentioned? Yes, please. Sydney.
Well, I'm reporting on Herbert Spencer.
Oh, Spencer. Okay, sure. Where would Spencer go? Have you looked at him yet?
A teensy bit.
A teensy bit.
I wouldn't know which way.
Okay. Yeah, he'd definitely go here. I'm going to steal a tiny amount of Sydney's thunder with respect to Spencer. Herbert Spencer takes a discipline that was actually invented by Comte. Comte gives us the term sociology. Okay. Before Comte, there was no such thing as sociology. So Comte has given us this wonderful new academic contribution. But notice Comte is on the pessimistic side, isn't he? Herbert Spencer comes along and takes the thought of his hero, Charles Darwin, and mixes it with the new discipline sociology, courtesy of Comte, and gives us evolutionary sociology. And it's Herbert Spencer who gives us the catchy little phrase, not Darwin. Spencer gives us the phrase, do you know what I'm about to say here? Any idea? He gives us the phrase, the survival of the fittest. That comes from Spencer. Most people think it came from Darwin. Not Darwin. It's consistent with Darwin, but it originates with Spencer. It is social Darwinism. Margaret Sanger was a great admirer of Herbert Spencer, I might add, the founder of Planned Parenthood. You know, but that's another story. Just one more detail here about Spencer. Spencer's, one of his best-known students was a guy named Walter Bagehot. Walter, he's not an important thinker, but he's an important link. So you got Darwin, Spencer, social Darwinian, Bagehot, who's a political theorist, college professor. One of his principal students was a guy by the name of Heinrich Himmler. These things matter. These things connect. You can draw a line from Darwin through Spencer, through Bagehot to Himmler. And it's the same philosophy. And that survival of the fittest mentality changes the way people view politics. Right? Okay, I saw it. Go ahead.
Is Himmler the guy that's connected to Hitler?
Yeah, he was the head of the SS. Right. Yes.
Can you briefly say what sociology is?
Oh. Sociology is that wonderful discipline that replaced civics with social studies. You know, there's a reason we don't teach social studies. Because every time we faculties say the word social studies, we have this sort of nausea that makes us want to go throw up. You know? So I don't want to be too graphic. I don't want to think I have strong feelings about it. But every time I hear the word social studies, I feel a lot better now. So, you know, it's just the way it is. It's just kind of...
What's the last letter of
H-O-T. Bagehot. H-O-T. Well, sociology is, to answer your question somewhat more, responsibly, the study of social behavior, how we organize ourselves into societies, how we recognize and measure the mores of societies, the behaviors, the way that we interact with each other. It usually incorporates studies of things like institutions like marriage, family, and related sorts of social organizational structures. It usually takes the view, for example, that marriage is a convention that developed in our evolutionary past because we found that it was better, it had greater survivability for us to enter into a marriage relationship than to just have kind of freewheeling, open, unstructured relationships with others without any kind of organizational guidance. So marriage is seen as a kind of evolutionary detail. Would be one example. Is that responsive? That's it. I think it's safe to say, or at least it's worth noting, that sociology generally tackles the problem of studying social behavior from an atheistic point of view. Not every sociologist is an atheist, don't get me wrong. But the way that sociology proceeds tends to be on an atheistic premise. Rather than saying God created a holy institution of matrimony, which is very fulfilling to us and is therefore good, it says marriage was the result of certain forces of biology that created this convention that became convenient for us. And that's a very different way to think about marriage. Right? So all I want you to get out of this has been a very random discussion, but all I wanted you to recognize is that as we now are at the cusp of the 19th century, we're going to be bouncing back and forth between and among these names. But I'm going to be saying, okay, we're going to look now at Darwin, who is an optimist, or we're going to be looking at Schleiermacher, or who's a pessimist, or whatever. We're going to be using this kind of jargon to sort of categorize these people. And I don't want to go through this whole discussion again. You'll have an idea what I'm driving at there. Fair enough? Got that? All right. Comments, questions? Final clarifying remarks? Anything? Got 1 minute? You got well less than 1 minute. So, Stephen, just give us a word of wisdom here. Give us an insight of genius. Final remarks. Be inspiring to all of us, guiding us to greater efforts and higher achievements. Stephen has given us a deep and profound allegory which we should all take to heart. As you're going through this day, please be cautious. Do not poke the bear with a stick. You'll all have to take that to heart and determine what it means for you. You're dismissed.